My name is Stephen Davis. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I have the delightful and easy task of moderating these three distinguished gentlemen with deep careers in central banking, and all of whom have made important analytical contributions to monetary policy and central banking as well. We're going to kick off with Jim Bullard, Dean, Purdue University Business School, and former president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. After Jim, we'll turn to Andy Levin of Dartmouth College, although Andy has asked that if Jim hits it out of the park, he'd like to go last. But I think we're going to make him go second. And then Athanasios Orphanides, currently at MIT, will round it up. Jim, it's all yours.
Great, thanks very much. This is called Jim's View of the World, I think, or Intellectual Leadership and its Influence on Fed Policy in the Post-War Era. So I'm gonna try this out on you and see what you think. In his book, The Age of Turbulence, Alan Greenspan relates an anecdote concerning his days as a graduate student in economics at Columbia University in New York in 1950 and 1951. Greenspan was pursuing an economics PhD, which he says was a go-to degree for a person with ambition in economics, even at that time. His graduate advisor was future Federal Reserve Chair Arthur Burns. Burns was a full professor and an important figure in macroeconomics, having published his book co-authored with Wesley Mitchell on business cycles and their measurement just a few years earlier. Greenspan describes Burns as an avuncular, pipe-smoking professor. He also says Burns liked to challenge his graduate students in class. One day, Burns asked the class, "What causes inflation?" There was no answer. Burns puffed on his pipe. Finally, he declared, "Excessive government spending causes inflation." Turbulence in Greenspan's personal life caused him to drop out of Columbia. But this pre-monetarism anecdote has stuck in my head as an indicator of the immediate post-war mindset regarding monetary policy, namely, that inflation was entirely a fiscal phenomenon. A few years later, in 1958, the St. Louis Fed hired Homer Jones to be the director of research. This was an attempt, ultimately very successful, by the bank to enter the world of academic-style research in order to apply that research to problems in monetary policy. Eventually, the bank, this paid off with the publication of the so-called St. Louis model, Lionel Anderson and Jerry Jordan. For many years, this was the most widely cited paper in all of macroeconomics. The results there indicated that monetary variables were statistically more important than fiscal variables. With this and other innovations, intellectual leadership on monetary policy shifted toward monetarist ideas. By 1979, with inflation in the US and around the world running out of control, this intellectual leadership entered the practical policy realm as the FOMC embarked on a, quote, monetarist experiment, end quote, under then Chair Paul Volcker. The experiment would put more emphasis on monetary variables and was ultimately successful in vanquishing inflation. The Volcker disinflation was a searing intellectual experience, the central macroeconomic event of the post-war era in the US. It leaves a large imprint on today's macroeconomic thinking. The central theoretical reason was the importance of credibility in achieving satisfactory monetary policy outcomes. That insight came most directly from Finn Kidlin and Ed Prescott in their 1977 Time and Consistency paper in the JPE. The paper stressed that failure to deliver on promised policy would be understood by an intelligent and forward-looking private sector, ultimately defeating the policymaker desires. This insight led to an entire literature on monetary policy games and was cited as part of the Nobel Prize awarded to Kidlin and Prescott in 2004. When we say that the Volcker disinflation was successful it is in the sense that the chaos of the 1970s was put behind us and a new era dawned. It was not just that Volcker ended the high and variable inflation of the 1970s. The period from late 1960s to the early 1980s was characterized by significant volatility on the real side of the economy as well. Later, the empirical literature would reveal that the pre-Volcker U.S. economy was more volatile in a statistically significant sense when compared to the post-Volcker economy for both real and nominal variables. While there were 4 recessions in the 13 years from 1970 to 1982, it would take about 40 years for the next 4 recessions to occur. The Volcker disinflation was also painful. The 1980-82 recession ultimately drove the unemployment rate to 10.8%, and it created the clear impression among a generation of academic economists, as well as most global financial market participants, that a large recession was necessary if the committee wished to reduce inflation from a high level. The clear implication was that one must not let inflation get out of hand or even begin to get out of hand. This led to an age of preemptive actual monetary policy. For instance, ECB Bank President Jean-Claude Trichet often used a phrasing that insisted that the central bank must remain especially vigilant, quote, concerning inflation developments. As another example, the campaign led by then Chair Janet Yellen called for increasing the policy rate in 2016 and 2017 when actual inflation remained below target. In one of the most important papers of post-war macroeconomics, Thomas J. Sargent argued in 1982 that expectations alone could be shifted by an agile policymaker, and that such a shift could be an extremely powerful policy tool. This method had the potential to end high inflation without recession. Sargent produced historical examples from post-World War II hyperinflations. In each of these cases, in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, in each of these cases, the hyperinflation ended abruptly on the day or even on the hour once a credible monetary and fiscal regime was put in place in each country. These disinflations did not have anything to do with Phillips curve effects. Sargent's recommendation from the ends of 4 big inflations paper did not work for Volcker. The Volcker FOMC was not able to end the double-digit U.S. inflation on the day in the manner of the European economies. This is because, as Goodfriend and King argued in 2005 JPE paper, the Volcker disinflation was, quote, incredible. Volcker had to earn back the Fed credibility that had been squandered during the 1970s. Nevertheless, Sargent's insight would prove useful in the monetary policy response to the post-pandemic inflation of 2021 to 2023 in the U.S., a point in time where the Fed had considerably more credibility. Good things came from the intellectual journey that led to the Volcker disinflation. The searing experience had taught macroeconomists that commitment and credibility were important, perhaps the most important aspects driving satisfactory monetary policy outcomes. It was also important, as monetarists had emphasized, to assign responsibility for inflation outcomes to the central bank. It was, after all, Paul Volcker, the Fed chair, and not the Treasury Secretary or the Senate Finance Committee that ended the inflation. As these ideas began to be widely understood, some simple extensions began to be considered. If credibility and commitment were important, should the central bank simply state an inflation target and take consistent action to achieve it so that observers of monetary policy could plan accordingly? By the early 1990s, the answer to this question was a resounding yes, and inflation targeting swept the global monetary policy. This process was aided and abetted by the European decision in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union to create by treaty a unified monetary policy union. Inflation targeting has been a rousing success. Inflation targeting countries have had lower inflation and inflation closer to target than in the pre-inflation targeting era. Countries that bucked the trend, including at times Turkey, Argentina, and Venezuela, ended up with considerable inflation. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Success in St. Louis with academic-style research caused other banks and the Board of Governors to get into the research game beginning in the 1970s. Perhaps most notably, the Minneapolis Fed began to partner with the University of Minnesota and asked some of the professors there to work with the research team at the bank. This partnership led to a proliferation of new innovative ideas that are still shaping the contours of macroeconomics today. By the time of the publication of Chris Sims' Macro and Reality paper in Econometrica in 1980 and Tom Sargent and Neil Wallace's Some Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic paper in the Minneapolis Fed's Quarterly Review in 1982, intellectual leadership had shifted again. This time, the shift was toward deeper and more unknown territory. These papers were methodological in nature. The Macro and Reality paper argued that the identification assumptions underlying most macro empirical work were, here's that word again, incredible. The Pleasant Monetarist Arithmetic paper made monetarist assumptions, but found that because of monetary fiscal interactions, policy conclusions could be distinctly non-monetarist. Their paper brought up other issues about multiple steady states and long-run rest points of the economy. The important point was forcefully made and intellectual leadership was seized. To truly get policy right, we were going to have to get more serious about the model building aspect of macroeconomics. Around this time, Bob Lucas remarked that, quote, when it comes to giving policy advice, we're in way over our heads. And indeed, more serious models were produced, notably when Kidler and Prescott produced their real business cycle paper, published their real business cycle paper in Econometrica in 1982. Here was a coherent micro-founded DSGE model that the authors argued fit the macroeconomic data relatively well. And shockingly, there was no effort to include monetary policy in the model at all. Perhaps even more shockingly, the equilibrium study was Pareto optimal, meaning that despite the business cycles embodied in the model, there was no role for policymakers to play. When Cooley and Hansen published their version of the RBC model with money in the AER in 1989, they found that the monetary aspect did not affect the cyclical variables of the model. This recalls Ronald Reagan's oft-used lament, sometimes I think we should just all go home. The lesson was clear. Generally speaking, markets are going to do a very good job of allocating resources in the economy. This is true even when considering dynamic stochastic settings. To study a role for policy, there has to be something wrong, some aspect of the environment that's preventing the invisible hand from allocating resources efficiently. This something wrong came to be known as a friction, and the most popular friction for monetary economics, for better or worse, came to be the sticky price friction. Michael Woodford described a model economy in his book, Interest and Prices, published in 2003. He wanted to analyze a fully specified dynamic stochastic economy like Kidler and Prescott, but one which also had an important friction in the form of sticky prices. He stressed in his introduction that he maintained a type of virtual RBC economy underneath his economy with sticky prices. This virtual RBC economy with its Pareto optimal allocation of resources would be attainable if either the sticky prices somehow became perfectly flexible or if the monetary authority followed an optimal policy regime that established the so-called Wickselian natural real rate of interest for the economy. The lesson was once again clear. If one wanted to impute an important role for monetary policy, one had to carefully specify what problem monetary policy is supposed to solve. For Woodford, it's the sticky price problem. This is what gives Woodford theoretical coherence. But in the realm of practical policymaking, it's far from clear that this is the type of role that is being ascribed to the FOMC. Instead, the FOMC cites the mandates written into US law, which include stable prices. Woodford's argument was that by pursuing a solution to the sticky price problem, the central bank would end up stabilizing prices. The new Keynesian model came to dominate discussions of monetary policy, provide intellectual leadership in the field, and provide insight for actual monetary policy discussions. The Taylor rule developed in John Taylor's 1993 paper could be incorporated into the new Keynesian framework to give practical recommendations on real-time monetary policy decisions. Monetary aggregates did not play a direct role, but in some circles, the model was considered new monetarist because of the way it adhered to many monetarist principles, not the least of which was that the monetary authority had the main responsibility for inflation outcomes and had to maintain credibility with respect to those outcomes. Many critical views of Federal Reserve policy characterize the FOMC as careening from one policy blunder to another. Little or nothing seems to go right, and each decision by the committee is a fraught affair that could sink the economy or lead to unstoppable inflation. The critical view is summed up in Rudy Dornbusch's famous quip, "Expansions don't die of old age, they're murdered by the Fed." Yet in the last 20 years, there have been just 2 recessions, both of which have clear causes. The global financial crisis stemmed from weaknesses in the U.S. non-bank financial sector, not something under the direct control of the FOMC, and the pandemic was a natural disaster. Did the new Keynesian consensus get enough of the pieces together to inform a reasonably stable monetary policy for the U.S. and other countries? Has the Holy Grail been attained to the extent that it can be? Perhaps. But the most recent candidate for a policy mistake is not the murdering of an expansion, but the fueling of an inflationary outburst in 2021 to 2023 of a type not seen in the U.S. since the Volcker era. How did it happen? I've argued elsewhere that the pandemic should be viewed as a war, and that the combination of wartime finance and low interest rates to support the war effort is known to produce inflation across many different times and places. To end the inflation, fiscal rectitude had to be restored to its pre-war level, and in addition, monetary policy had to return to orthodoxy. Both of these conditions occurred as divided government returned to the U.S. after the 2022 midterm elections, and the Fed began raising rates aggressively during 2022. Inflation began to fall simultaneously with these developments and without a recession. As Sargent had suggested, the aggressive moves by the FOMC during this period shifted expectations back to pre-pandemic norms to an extent large enough to bring inflation under control. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to John Taylor and to Marie Christine, a really remarkable conference. I feel really fortunate to be able to participate. And actually, thanks to Steve for herding cats on our panel today. So my remarks are going to be drawn from work that I've been doing over the last year and a half with Christina Skinner, who's a legal scholar at Wharton. I'm really proud that actually our article is going to be published in the Vanderbilt Law Review next month. So I'm patting myself on the back that I get to have a law journal article on my resume. It's more than 50 pages, but like I think a couple hundred footnotes. So I'm not sure I want to urge you to go read it. But actually, a synopsis, executive summary of it's been recently posted at Mercatus, thanks to David Beckworth and his colleagues. So you could look at that one. Anyway, I'm going to talk about this briefly. And anything I say that's intelligent and wise, you can attribute to Christina. Anything else imprudent or unwise, I'll take responsibility for. Okay, so the bottom line message is pretty simple as far as I'm concerned, which is the Federal Reserve needs an external review. Let me just repeat it again. The Federal Reserve needs an external review. So there's been a lot of attention recently to the Fed's getting started with doing another internal framework review. So in these remarks now, I just want to kind of make the case here why I think an external review is needed. And I saw Roger Ferguson last night. I guess he might be here somewhere. He was one who came to the Federal Reserve and brought us kind of management 101 principles. And the idea of external review, as far as I'm concerned, is management 101. Like whenever you have an organization, a good organization, hospital, company, it doesn't matter what it is, occasionally you bring in outside consultants to take a look. And ideally, the CEO of the board say, look, take a look at everything and tell us what we can do better. Simple. And so the ideal here really would be for the Federal Reserve to welcome an external review. Chair Powell, this fall sometime could, at a press conference or a speech, just say, we would welcome an external review and here's how we think it could be done. Another possibility is that the Fed has a boss, Congress is the Federal Reserve's boss. The Fed is not an independent branch of government. I think all of you know that from elementary school. There's only three: executive, legislative, judicial. Under the Constitution, the monetary policy is actually given to the Congress as a constitutional duty. Congress has delegated that duty to the Federal Reserve. Congress is the Fed's boss. And as the Fed's boss, Congress should be requiring the Federal Reserve not just to do a one-off, but to do regular, comprehensive external reviews. Okay, so why? One of the things I heard all the time when I was at 20 years in the Fed staff, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay, I think when we look back at these last 5 years, we can see several major things that deserve an external review. One of them is risk management. I actually thought that Governor Waller's talk today at lunch was fantastic because I've been advocating for more than 10 years the Fed should be doing scenario analysis and contingency planning publicly. In fact, I think we heard about that at the Hoover conference back in May from President Goolsbee. I would be thrilled if Chair Powell would announce this fall that part of the internal framework review that the Fed will be doing is to look carefully at how they're going to incorporate risk management into the public communications. Now, Mickey and Mike Bordo and I wrote a paper in June of 2020. We actually gave it a shadow meeting. I think maybe more than one. It's an MBR working paper and a Hoover working paper on scenario analysis. I'll give all the credit to Mickey and Mike because actually at the time I was worried that we were heading into another Great Depression. I was pessimistic about vaccines coming. They were actually optimistic and turned out to be right. In January 2021, actually between December 27th of 2020 and March 15th, if I remember right, of 2021, the Congress put in place $3 trillion in fiscal stimulus in a course of 3 months, completely unprecedented. The Federal Reserve should have been already in the late fall, but certainly by winter and early spring, asking hard questions about how this might change the outlook. I just heard a talk at Dartmouth the other day, Karen Dinan and Doug Elmendorf, talking about the fiscal stimulus and how extraordinary historic it was. It just pleaded for the Fed to be doing a big rethink already at that time, and they didn't. Okay, so risk management, scenario analysis, contingency planning has to be done. By the way, you all know the Bank of England just had an external review. Wow, who did it? If I'm used to teaching, I'm sorry. So someone raised their hand, like, who did it? Like in my class, I was going, no, I'm going to call on you. And I asked someone, okay, so we all know our good friend, colleague, Nobel Prize winner, Chair Bernanke, did the external review for the Bank of England. What did he recommend? Scenario analysis, contingency planning, like improvements in forecasting. Why can't the Federal Reserve just ask him to come in and look at the Fed? Or ideally, I think it'd be better, because of course he's not completely an outsider, to get 3 academics, maybe John Taylor. We could pick randomly, probably from this room, 3 or 4 or 5 people, just volunteer and send them in to do it, to be a team. Chair Powell could announce that tomorrow or next week. Maybe he has to take a little time to get it together. Okay, but it could be done. Okay, number 2. Cost-benefit analysis. The Federal Reserve's policies are going to cost the U.S. taxpayers over $1 trillion. And when Bill Nelson and I first started working on this, it was kind of controversial, like, oh, how could that be? But now it's actually it's clear on the Fed's balance sheet. They've already had to borrow a couple $100 billion. What I teach, and we all know this from Econ 1, is opportunity cost. So you can't just count the direct magic asset of the Fed. You got to look at how much would the Federal Reserve be paying in remittances right now if they hadn't done QE. And so the cost of $1 trillion is real money. It's not just kind of paper losses here. We're talking about real cost to taxpayers. Did the Fed do cost benefit analysis before they put the program in place? Have they done it since? Now we're 3 years past the conclusion of the program. We still haven't seen it. Fed Chair Powell could announce tomorrow or next week that the Fed is part of its framework review doing a cost benefit analysis ex post of that program, but then with implications for the next time around. 3 is the policy deliberation process. I'm very troubled still by the fact that there were no dissents during 2021. I'm really troubled by it. It was a very complex period. There were people outside. Larry Summers on one end, and I'll say Mickey and Mike maybe in the middle somewhere, or a little bit on the other end. Okay, but reasonable, smart, intelligent people raising questions. Why was there not a single dissent within the Fed? And I think the answer is because the way that the policymaking process works is not the way Congress intended. Congress intended it to be an independent commission. The members of the Federal Reserve Board have 14-year terms. The Congress is imagining that they would be like federal judges, everyone individually accountable. The whole idea of consensus and unified kind of we're going to have all our discussions behind closed doors, and then we're going to present a unified front to the public. No, that is not what Congress intended. And it wasn't just 2021. It's amazing to me, it's troubling to me that we have 12 Federal Reserve Bank presidents today, and they're all smart people, wonderful, amazing people. But not a single one of them has dissented from any FOMC decision. I mean, in this room, I guess we have, let's see, Charlie Plosser, I think, is here. How many times he dissented? Tom Honig, how many times he dissented? I know Loretta dissented a few times. Jim Bullard, we all know he's dissented. And Charlie Evans, and we could go down the list. How come not a single one of the 12 who are there now are dissenting? The Fed needs an external review. It has to encompass the selection process. For the selection of the Federal Reserve President, it should encompass the budgeting. I'm really disappointed that Ed Nelson is not here today. Does anyone know why? He was invited, he was on the program. It's public knowledge because it was the email. Okay, he said that he was unable to come because the Federal Reserve Board changed their travel expense policies. And in effect, the Federal Reserve Board said they couldn't afford to send him here today. That's what it really boils down to. And this is, of course, part of a broader effort to tighten the Fed's belt. I guess is the phrase they would use, tighten our belts, which has also affected the recruitment of research economists to the 12 regional Feds. I'm troubled by it. I don't think this is the right way. If the Fed needs to tighten its belt to save, what, $500 or $1,000 for Ed not to be able to come here to this conference, not the right way to do it, especially if they've lost $1 trillion. It's just peanuts. Okay, they need an external review. Now, let me just say briefly, why can't the Federal Reserve do this itself? And I think the answer we know, by the way, I think this was Tom Honig at lunch today. He said if he had it to do over again, he got a PhD in economics and math. Sorry, where's Tom? Right here, there. Am I remembering right? Okay. And he said he kind of wished in retrospect that he got a PhD in psychology. And I totally hear it. By the way, some of my best students at Dartmouth are joint majors in econ and psychology. It's because we know from human nature, it's very difficult to be critical of yourself and your past decisions. It's just difficult to do it. And some people are willing to do it, but it's not that easy to take an honest objective look. It's a lot easier to ask a friend or a colleague or someone you trust to do it. The Federal Reserve should initiate an external review. They don't have to wait for their boss, which is Congress, to do it. The Federal Reserve should initiate it. And there are plenty of people on the earth, maybe some of the central bankers that we heard from earlier from other countries, some are in the audience here from Switzerland or Norway or Canada or whatever, pick it out of a random out of a hat. And a few academics, okay, and open the doors to them, give them complete access to everything, and ask them to write a public report that would go to Congress, which is the Fed's boss, and the Fed could respond to it. And the Fed might not agree with it all. But this is management 101 again, because when you hire management consultants and they come in, if it's a well done process, you can set it up where you say, "Oh, I'm going to tell you what we really want you to write, and make sure this is the." No, that's not good, right? What you actually do is you ask the management consultants to take a complete look at everything and come with their honest view. And you don't have to agree with their conclusions, but it's helpful to provoke discussion and serious consideration. Okay, so last point here. The Fed should have regular external reviews, and they should be done by the Government Accountability Office, which reviews every other U.S. federal government agency, including independent ones like SEC and FDIC. They're all subject to comprehensive reviews by GAO. Why shouldn't the Federal Reserve be subject to comprehensive regular reviews by GAO? You could put some protections in place to make sure there's no political interference, but take advantage of them. GAO reviews NASA. GAO is reviewing right now the use of AI in the federal government's law enforcement, because AI is now being used for fingerprint detection and facial recognition. I would say, look, if GAO can do rocket science and they can do AI, then they should be competent, and maybe they need to hire a few consultants to help them, but they could do regular comprehensive reviews of the Fed. The other is a fully independent IG. I will stop there. But again, I hope this is a very simple, clear takeaway. The Fed needs an external review. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Steve. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to start by saying that I agree with virtually everything both Jim and Andy have said, but instead I'm going to use slides, and I will try to focus on the topic of the session, which I understood to be the Fed's evolving interpretation and implementation of its mandate. So I'm going to start with a picture, which is the picture I usually start from. I'm just taking it back to the beginning, and ask you to simply have a look at the Federal Reserve's record in maintaining price stability since the founding of the Federal Reserve. Of course, we know that this record is checkered, and I want you to see there. I don't think I can point here, but I want you to see we have the recent episode, the post-pandemic inflation is one spike. We have the great inflation episode as another one. And I want you to see two before. We have one in the early days of the Federal Reserve and another one in the 1940s. So what I want to do is mention that, first of all, you can see there has been an improvement in the Fed's record in delivering price stability since the founding of the shadow 50 years ago. I mean, if it were not for the post-pandemic policy error, I think we would have been giving the Fed a pretty good grade for managing this. So this is the first thing I want to do. But then the second thing I want to do is link this performance and the occasional policy errors, including the latest one, to the evolution of the interpretation of the Fed's mandate. And to do that, I will put out the actual three key pieces of legislation that give the statutory mandate of the Federal Reserve: 1913, 1946, the Employment Act, 1977, with Humphrey Hawkins, the adjustment to that. But then focus on the fact that really, if you have a look at this, you're going to realize that over its history, the Fed has operated with a statutory mandate that has not explicitly recognized price stability as the primary goal of monetary policy. If you check the current law from 1977, price stability is one of three objectives that are there in parallel. So starting from this element, this is different. This depends on the central bank, how it's done. This is the case for the Fed. Starting from that, we need to realize that the Fed's success in delivering price stability and fostering the good economic performance that is associated with it has rested over the past 110 years on the interpretation of its policy strategy. A critical issue is at what times in its history the Fed has focused on systematic policy, focused on preserving price stability with modest counter-cyclical stabilization, and on what periods it has not acted in this fashion. And what I want to argue, and I will give you a few examples, is that at times the Fed avoided the temptation to overreach and focused on defending price stability as a means of fostering growth and prosperity. I'm going to identify briefly before the founding of the shadow in the 1950s to have been a period like that. And then since the founding of the Shadow Open Market Committee, I would identify the Greenspan-Volcker era like that. And this is the period that that corresponds in some respect to what Bob Hetzel in the previous session was describing as the leaning against the wind kind of approach. And we see episodes like that. But then at other times, the Fed has interpreted its mandate in an overambitious fashion, raising expectations about what it can do that were beyond what is feasible to do with monetary policy. And I'm going to identify the 1970s as a period like that. In the recent years, when I look at the 2020 strategy review under Chair Powell, I see, yep, this is yet another example of overreach, reaching to this point. And let me actually start by going back. One of the sources that I found very useful for understanding the Fed's thinking and communication of its strategy is to look at successive editions of the Federal Reserve System, its purposes and functions. So this is a quote from the first edition in 1939. Now, recall 1939, the mandate of the Fed was, accommodate business, no mention of price stability anywhere. And the Fed was struggling to find out a way to interpret its mandate to do reasonable policy. And you can see how they interpreted it. They interpreted the mandate in a way by saying, well, really what you need to do is understand what the role of all government policy is, and for the Federal Reserve, really is to maintain monetary conditions favorable for an active and sound use of the country's productive facilities, full employment mentioned explicitly, and the rate of consumption reflecting widely diffused well-being. This is wonderful, wonderful language. And of course, the 1930s is exactly the period when the Fed committed its worst series of policy errors. This actually shows you a little bit of a disconnect of the nice language about what the intent may have been, but also the fact that they totally missed it. And this is an illustration that good intentions do not imply good policy. In this case, you're going to see that there is no mention of price stability anywhere. And from today's perspective, and based on what the Shadow Market Committee has been pushing the last 50 years, that's where you start if you want to have good outcomes. And that was totally missing. Now, I already showed you before, 1946 was a major change after the disaster of the Great Depression, after the war. The enactment of the Employment Act made it a legal responsibility for all government agencies to pursue maximum employment. This is what the law was. But then you have to ask, what was the interpretation? Well, the Fed was actually careful. Even though the law said maximum employment, the Fed did not ever, as far as I can tell, describe what it was doing as trying to achieve maximum employment. So in 1947, in the second edition of the Purposes and Functions, you see the concept of high level of employment, which is far more reasonable than maximum employment. And this is a way in which the Fed was, of course, trying to respect the letter of the law, but interpreting that in a way that was more reasonable. I'm going to show you one more thing. 1947, I really admire how refreshingly transparent the Fed was with this quote from the second edition regarding inflation. And recall the first two episodes of inflation that I had shown you. What were those? Well, the first one was the first decade of the Fed's operations, when the Fed really had to finance World War I. And the second one was the Fed financing World War II. It's very clear. And I wish the Fed was far more transparent more recently. If it is true, as Jim has suggested, that some of the effects of what we saw in the pandemic were like wartime monetary finance. But you can see here in 1947, the Fed is saying, look, we know what our legal mandate is. Prevention of inflation had to become secondary to providing the sinews of war. Very, very clear cut. But then again, despite the wording of the law being from 1946 on maximum employment, in the 1950s era under Chair Martin, the Fed was trying very hard to interpret its mandate in a more reasonable fashion and get better outcomes. So you can see the third edition in 1954, for example, describing what is the basic function of the Federal Reserve System. What is it? Is to make possible a flow of credit and money that will foster orderly economic growth. That's it. No maximum employment there. Of course, recognizing that this contributes to a rising standard of living and so forth. So what happened later on? How is it that starting from this and with no changes in the statutory mandate of the Federal Reserve, we ended up with great inflation later on? What happened? And well, a number of things happened. There were misperceptions, a slowdown in productivity, missing the euro, and so forth. But really, those are technical mistakes that if you have a price stability focused central bank, do not lead to a very high level of inflation. They do lead to a very high level of inflation if you also have a difference in the interpretation of the mandate of the Fed. And indeed, Arthur Burns gave us the answer to that in his anguish speech in September of 1979. So I have here just one quote from that speech. The first paragraph saying, of course, the Fed had the power to prevent inflation. That's not, Burns was not disputing that. But number two, highlighting the Employment Act prescribes that it is the continuing policy and responsibility of the federal government to utilize all its plans, functions, and resources to promote maximum employment. The Federal Reserve is subject to this provision of law, and that has limited its practical scope for restrictive actions. So this was Burns' answer to, hey, I take the law more seriously than everybody else. Too bad if it actually results in high inflation. Of course, we know the law can be interpreted in different ways. When Arthur Burns delivered this address in Belgrade in September 1979, people at the board were already working on Paul Volcker's revolution that happened, I think, 2 weeks after this speech was delivered. The law didn't change between September and October of 1979. The interpretation of the law changed, and this is how we came back to have a better way of operating. Of course, we know what the results are during the disinflation, during the chairmanships of Volcker and Greenspan. I don't remember the Fed mentioning maximum employment in any of the speeches, either by Paul Volcker or Alan Greenspan, as how the Fed was operating. Instead, in both cases, they were acting as if price stability was the primary mandate of the Fed, and explaining, as in the quote I have in the third bullet here, that the reason for going after price stability is because of the maximum sustainable economic growth that we associate with it. And as you would have imagined, this was indeed reflected in the subsequent editions of the Purposes and Functions. If you actually read the version from 1984, what is the Fed's goal? Well, it's to ensure that growth in money and credit over the long run is sufficient to encourage growth in the economy in line with its potential and with reasonable price stability. This is actually exactly what Bob Hetzel was talking about when he was describing reasonable periods of policy at the Fed. But of course, things did not change, did not stay like that. Things did change after the global financial crisis. With the global financial crisis and the very high unemployment that resulted, the way the Fed started communicating its objectives shifted quite a bit. In 2012, we have maximum employment showing up. And in 2020, we have the prominence of maximum employment really being elevated further in various ways. Unsurprisingly, you end up with high inflation once you do that. So I'm going to conclude, I think just looking at this, we can all agree that price stability is essential. The question is how to interpret the Fed's statutory mandate in order to deliver good outcomes over time. With the current mandate, in my view, the Fed can be more successful if it simply avoids the temptation to overreach. It has done this successfully in the past. It can benefit from clear definition of price stability, 2%, but some of the other so-called improvements, especially in the 2020 framework, the Fed can probably do better without. Thanks.
While the speakers are coming back to the stage, those are three engaging talks. I'm going to ask the first question, and it relates directly to Jim's emphasis on credibility or its absence in the conduct or successful or unsuccessful conduct of monetary policy. And also, so this idea of credibility, it's the way Jim told the story. It's kind of a nice storytelling after the fact for when inflation fighting was successful and when it was not, and it sounds persuasive. That's really the way you think about monetary policy. Then why doesn't the Fed and central banks around the world devote enormous energy to assessing in real time the credibility its monetary policy stance? Now, it's not enough just to look at expectations for a couple of reasons. Expectations, central banks do a lot of them. And that tells you about central moments. Expectations derived from financial markets tell you about the marginal participants. Credibility is more encompassing than just expectations. Make this point with a concrete example. You're standing in the middle of 2020 or late 2020, or the vaccine was announced. There was tremendous uncertainty as to, even in 2021, there was still a lot of uncertainty how well the vaccine would work. So what you needed was not just an expectation, because people, naturally enough, have widely varying expectations. Heard a little bit of that about how the pandemic would unfold. And so what you need to ask people is directly questions about their, that get to the credibility of the central bank if you're going to take a survey approach. If the pandemic lasts such and such long and requires this much government spending, and here I'm playing off the wartime analogy, will the Fed switch its monetary policy to it as appropriate when the pandemic's largely in the past? It's very hard to get at that by just looking at expectations. So I guess I have a question. If credibility is really central, why not try to measure it in a really serious, rigorous, ongoing way, pretty much as a matter of course for central banks?
Well, I mean, sure, metrics are great, and I would be all in favor of if we could get better measures of Fed credibility, then I'd be in favor of getting those. I do think that, you know, if you look at a model and you say, what would the inflation expectation of inflation be 5 to 10 years in the future? It should always be exactly 2%. And, you know, and you don't see that in the data. You see it diverging from that every so often. And what we saw, I think, in the second half of 2021 and the first half of 2022 was that those seem to be diverging a little bit and quite a bit over shorter horizons. And I take that as a kind of measure of the credibility of the central bank. I mean, you know, in the model that would never happen because you just have perfectly credible policy all the time. But in the real world, traders, financial markets, they start to wonder maybe we're coming into a new era and the Fed won't do its job and somehow rationalize high inflation and just leave it high. So I think that was happening in mid 2022, and I've seen some graphs. Actually, Athanasios has some good charts on this. But once the Fed started raising rates, especially the 475 basis point increases in a row, that expectation got quashed right back down to 2%. The Fed was serious and they were going to achieve the 2% target.
Thanks. Let's open it up and see John Cochran was first with his hand up as usual. Then we'll come over here.
I know how to get a word in edgewise. I've been here before. This was great, and I'll limit myself to two short questions for Andy, which were a wonderful discussion. So the first on dissents. You make an important case, but some institutions are good with dissents, some aren't. The Supreme Court uses dissents. I remember many faculty meetings where we fought and fought and fought, but we did not say this was, 35 to 22. And then for the next rest of the per candidate's life, we're going, well, I voted against you. We all agree to vote 100% and carve it out of the value function. In the Fed's case, it is trying to convince people, it's trying to manage expectations, it's trying to set at least an idea that it's following a rule-based policy. And I would think that a constant cacophony of dissents, you'll remember Larry Summers came and said, no, you should have no dissents. A constant cacophony of dissents would lead to much more what's the politics, what's up and down, much less ability to tie itself to at least the perception of a rule. The second one, you said external reviews would be wonderful. I mentioned the GAO is a wonderful idea. I like the idea of external reviews, but as we look across administrative agencies, they are the ones who get GAO reviews. They are not all models of apolitical technocratic competence. You mentioned NASA, who can't put up a rocket for under 10 times what it costs SpaceX to do the same thing. The FTC, the SEC, and those they are not. They're all on various whole of government crusades of one thing or another. The Fed is probably the best managed government agency this side of the National Weather Service, and certainly better than all the others. So I am a little bit worried that this GAO external view hasn't produced wonderful results everywhere else.
Okay, actually, I'm really glad that you asked the first question, because I think that it's amazing that Governor Mickey Bowman dissented from the last decision. You have to remember that this is the first time in about 20 years that a Federal Reserve Board member has dissented from any FOMC decision. And her courage and, is just amazing, extraordinary. Now, I personally think that it was good for the Fed. And I think, as Governor Waller said at lunch today, the data's come in the last few weeks in a direction that there's now scenarios certainly that were not visible on the day of the FOMC meeting. There are scenarios now where the Fed actually needs to plateau the rates. And I think the extent to which by dissenting, Governor Bowman conveyed a sense of this is a complex, difficult judgment call was helpful to the Fed and helpful to the public and should be helpful to the markets. And you could ask Jeff Lacker, Charlie Plosser, as I said, Esther George, Tom Honig, there's 5 or 6 people, Jim Bullard, sorry, Jim, here you go, Jim, who've dissented. And I think that in each of those cases, it was a thoughtful, careful dissent, respectful, difference in judgment that I think is absolutely appropriate to a public institution. And not only that, but that's how Congress set it up. Congress set it up to have individually accountable, independent people making decisions. They didn't want it to be made behind closed doors and then come out and pretend. Faculty meetings is different. We're talking about a public institution whose decisions are affecting millions of people. Okay, second question. GAO has saved $1 trillion to the taxpayers. And they actually have external reviews by the auditors of other countries that come in, review the GAO. They're very open. Okay, there's room for improvement at GAO too. But you can't blame the management consultant if they come in and do a review and make, so with the extent to which NASA may have some problems with, or any of the other agencies you mentioned, okay, GAO will come in and review the Fed, and the Fed may not take all of that advice, but do it. Just get the advice.
Okay, we get in the middle here and yes, you were next and then we'll come over to you. And then we'll come-
Okay, David Papel. This question is for Andy Levin. It strikes me that if you want to have an external review of the Fed, the first step would be to have somebody ask Chair Powell publicly, why aren't you doing an external review? Now, I know you can't ask him that question, and I can't ask him that question, but there are a whole bunch of people, reporters, who ask questions at every single press conference and can ask him that question. So my question for you, and in fact, a number of whom attend the Hoover Monetary Policy Conference on a regular basis and would be very familiar with this, and maybe someone who's attending this conference here and right now. I don't know the answer to that. But so my question is, why don't you ask them? Why don't you contact the reporters who will ask tough questions at the press conferences and suggest they ask that question?
So I take that as a suggestion more than a question. Do you want to respond, or Jim may want to respond?
First of all, I applaud the reporters who are here. I know some of them well. Okay, and what I would say is that the Fed has established ground rules for press conferences that if you make the chair uncomfortable, you may not be invited to come back again. And I think that's very different than press conferences at other agencies. I think those ground rules are not helpful to the public. Again, this is part of where Congress should initiate an external review to ask partly about, to what extent is the Fed being challenged in the media?
Jim?
Yeah, I would just say on this that I certainly got asked about audit the Fed many times, and there is a kind of standard answer inside the Fed, which is that there are three groups that are already auditing the Fed. So you've got an external auditor that does an audit every single year. Then you've also got internal audit, and which I found, I found to be actually very effective and very useful inside the Fed. Those are at the various banks. And then you've got the Inspector General, and that's been beefed up in recent years, and they're doing even more work than they did before. So if you actually add up the audit hours, which we did at one point inside the Fed, it's phenomenally high. So it's not, this kind of audit the Fed idea, which was, no one's looking at any of this, I think is not the right view of this. There's a ton of auditing already going on in the Fed. So
Thank you.
and also the GAO is the arm of Congress. The reason that they have the Inspector General set up is because it's an independent, the board is an independent agency. So that's just how it's done all around Washington. If you're an independent agency, then you have the Inspector General. The thought has been that you call it an independent agency, then you don't use GAO, use the Inspector General. That's the way it's done inside Washington. They could change those rules.
I'm sorry, just as a matter of fact, this is in the paper with Christina. Okay, and by the way, it's a Hoover working paper, so if you want to see the earlier draft of it, it's a matter of fact that GAO does comprehensive reviews of every other independent federal agency, including FDIC, SEC, OCC. The Federal Reserve got an exemption in the 1970s that exempts the Fed, and in particular the monetary policy function of the Fed. But that's the only exemption. Even CIA and the other, the GAO has to be careful, of course, how it does those national security kinds of things. But the Fed is really the exception right now. I think the boss should think about that exception.
And so your paper is probably going to be very useful on this dimension. But now that I think of it, the Fed, there was an audit of the boards of directors, I believe, of the Federal Reserve banks. My fellow colleagues might remember that. So there was some work on that at once.
Actually, after after the financial crisis, Ben Bernanke, in his testimony to Congress, he said, we would welcome a GAO review of all of our emergency facilities. And the GAO did one, and I think it was helpful. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is in this world. Okay. And actually, Dodd-Frank also asked the GAO specifically to do an audit at the time of the selection of the Federal Reserve Bank presidents. It's right.
Yeah.
But the changes that we were talking about in the selection procedure actually happened 5 years later. Maybe Congress
So
asked to do an
let's
update.
move on because there's more people want to ask questions. There's clearly been some auditing done and Andy wants more. Okay, so right here, yes.
So Robert King, Boston University. I wanted to comment on Andy's presentation, but Steve said something that also required me to make an observation. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working conceptually on modeling credibility and reputation in an internally consistent manner and making explicit comparisons to US inflation data. My conclusion off that is it's the biggest single thing in terms of understanding the ups and downs of inflation in the United States. But as part of that process, in ways that are related to what you asked, I did a literature survey, Google survey, et cetera, and I looked for the phrase estimated reputation and estimated credibility, and I found almost no studies that had that combination of phrases. One, interestingly, happened to be Axel Weber's thesis. Okay, now turning to Andy. I think what you say is definitely something that the U.S. government should do, but I want to consider the role of the SOMC and its influence on monetary policy, because in a way, it's an auditor. It's a reviewer of practices and the way in which Federal Reserve information is now provided is that analysts can go back 5 years later, maybe, and they can look at what were the arguments that were made by Federal Reserve officials for particular positions and critically appraise them. So if I want to argue, was Jim Bullard a good inflation forecaster or not, and do I like his arguments, yes or no, everything's there in print. Now, in the way I think about things, I sharply divide the Fed between a monetary authority and a banking/credit authority. And the degree of information we have about the credit dimensions of Fed decision-making is so much smaller. Typically, an FOMC meeting, or at least some of them, begin in the following way. Well, let's close the meeting of the board and open the meeting of the FOMC. That is, let's stop talking by ourselves about huge decisions and let's go to the open committee. So we can't really tell anything about the rationales for interventions that, to my mind, in the last several decades, have been far more consequential than the monetary policy decisions. So even if we can't get Andy's external authority to come in and look at things in detail, if there were standards set for the reporting of the board in its decision process, I think that would be huge. I think otherwise we're going to be stuck with the view of the Fed that's well captured by Jenna Smialek's book, which is limitless.
Okay. All right, I need guidance from the organizers here. We're now at 60 minutes. Do you want to go longer or should we cut it off? We're going to stop. Okay. I want to thank the panelists. That was a great discussion. Obviously, there's appetite for more.